Welcome to the Detroit Institute of Arts Thursdays at the Museum program. I am Salvador Salor Pons, Director of the DIA. Thank you for joining us for the first virtual suffragette tour, highlighting women's history in art. This program was designed in partnership with the Oakland County Commission and Commissioner Marsha Gershenson to celebrate the heroes of the movement that created equality at the ballot box for women in America. We are honored to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment with the residents of Oakland, Macomb, and Wayne counties. We would like to thank those residents for their continued support of the DIA. Commissioner Gershenson is the Vice Chairwoman of the Oakland County Board of Commissioners and represents portions of the city of Farmington Hills, Bloomfield Township, and West Bloomfield Township. I am pleased and honored that she has joined us today to introduce our program. Thank you.
Commissioner Gershenson, your mic is...
Okay, sorry about that. We'll start it again. But I wanted to thank Salvador and everyone that's watching at home. We're happy that even during this time of physical distancing, we're able to find ways to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. These virtual tours are exciting because they take a look at the amazing accomplishments of women through yet another lens, and that is art. We're so glad we're able to make this happen with our partners at the DIA. There's so much to share on this topic that this is the second virtual tour in our two-part series. If you missed last week, you can find it on the DIA's Facebook page. The tours are hosted by DIA docents Howard Rosenberg, Ray Henney, and this week we're joined by Cynthia Patrick. I'd like to invite you to ask questions during the program. We want this to be an interactive experience. You can ask a question by selecting the Q&A icon on the right side of your screen. Questions will be read on screen by Christine Mark, the DIA's Manager of Volunteer Development. So please welcome Howard Rosenberg, Ray Henney, and Cynthia Patrick.
Hi, I'm Howard Rosenberg.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Patrick. I'm new to the team, and it's my privilege to be here with you today.
Hi, I'm Ray Henney, and welcome, Cindy. Hello, Howard.
Hello.
Commissioner, would you please do us the honor of starting off this tour by reading us the 19th Amendment?
Phone's muted. I'd be happy to. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. We very much appreciate it and your participation in this. So last week we examined several works of art from the 18th and 19th centuries concerning women, many of which were portraits. Virtually all those works displayed the male-dominated culture in America of that time. Women generally didn't have their own lives, as their identities were subsumed by their fathers or their husbands' status and control. This week, we explore art that reflects the changing roles of women in the late 19th, in the 20th century, and into the 21st centuries, and their movement, those women's movement toward equality. Howard is going to start us off with two women artists who demonstrate those changing roles. Howard, take it away, my friend.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Gershenson, Salvador, for the introductions. Welcome, Cindy. We're looking forward to hearing from you today. And let's begin with a very famous American artist named Mary Cassatt. And this is how we ended last week. To give you a little brief overview of where we were, just to put everything in context. Mary Cassatt was born in 1844 and passed away in 1926. So her lifetime encompassed the scope of the women's suffrage movement. The Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention was in 1848, 4 years after Mary Cassatt was born. And as we just heard, the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote was passed in 1920. Mary Cassatt was a very strong supporter of women's rights. She was also a brilliant artist. This is a painting of her brother Alexander Cassatt, who was the president of the Pennsylvania National Railroad. And this is what she's most famous for. Her portraits and her renditions of women and children. And the power, the nurturing, the care, the loveliness of how she portrays these women and their children is a very famous hallmark of her paintings. And this here is Mary herself. This is around 1900, so about 20 years before the 19th Amendment was passed. And you can see that she has a face of determination that is not going to be, nothing is going to stop her from achieving the goals that she set forth for herself. Mary was born into a wealthy family. As I said, her brother was a president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Her family was active and supported very many progressive causes. She entered the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art when she was 15 years old, but found it less than fulfilling because she was not allowed to paint live models the same way men were allowed to paint live models. Women were thought to be less of a student than men were. So she left, she went to Paris. She enrolled in the Beaux-Arts Academy, but had experienced the same thing, prejudice and discrimination against her because of her gender. However, she overcame that with her talent, her will, and her determination. And she was befriended and became close friends with many of the Impressionists. And Edward Degas invited her to exhibit her work along with the other Impressionists in 1877. In 1915, she showed a series of 18 pieces in an exhibition to raise money to support the women's suffrage movement. So she was intimately involved right from the beginning with everything in the suffrage movement, and she's a wonderful painter. In the DIA, when we reopen, you will enjoy seeing her pieces on display in the American Wing. Christine, are there any questions about Mary or her work so far?
Not at this time, Howard.
Thanks, Christine. So let's go on. So what you are looking at here is a small niche, a cut in a wall that holds these vases. And what we're going to talk about are the tiles behind the vases. So if you were standing in the Great Hall in the museum, facing Rivera Court, having come in from the Woodward entrance, to your left, you would walk into the center gallery, and immediately you would turn right or left, and you would see these niches that contain these Pewabic pottery pieces. And they are done by Mary Chase Perry, later Stanton, after she married the architect who designed the Pewabic pottery building. Mary Chase Perry was from the Upper Peninsula, from Houghton area. And when she named her business Pewabic Pottery, she named it after an Ojibwe name for metal. And she is a very famous, innovative ceramicist. She began the ceramics program at University of Michigan. She taught at Wayne State University. She started the Arts and Crafts Society in Detroit, which is now the Center for Creative Studies. She was on the board of trustees in the DIA. She began a business with her partner, a man. In 1903, she employed a number of people, both men and women, 17 years before she was allowed to vote. She was an entrepreneur and innovator. She received the highest award, the Binns Medal, in 1947 for ceramics. It's like the Nobel Prize for ceramics. She was innovative to the sense of, and it's a little difficult to see, but if you look up here, you can see how shiny these tiles are. She invented a process that created iridescent glazes, which are still unique today and are well known in the museum, in the world. She has her pieces in museums at Cranbrook, at many places around Detroit and around the country. This is a photograph of Mary when in the 1940s, and it was thank you Pewabic Pottery for allowing us to display this. Christine, are there any questions about Mary Chase Perry Stanton?
Howard, is Pewabic pottery still available in Detroit today?
Yes, it is still available. It's on East Jefferson near Belle Isle. They're open regularly now. With the pandemic, you'd have to call to see their hours. They have a wonderful sale every Christmas. They have training classes. They are a ongoing concern in the Detroit area. Any other questions?
No, thank you. So almost 120 years later, her business is still going strong.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
Ray.
Thanks, Howard. And I have to say, we actually have some Pewabic tile on a fireplace, and it's delightful and affordable. So this is a wonderful piece by Florine Stetten Himer. It's called Love Flight of a Pink Candy Heart from 1930. It's actually pretty large. It's 5 feet tall and over 3 feet wide, unframed. The artist, like the two artists that Howard just presented, also demonstrated the dramatic changing roles of women in the late 19th and the early 20th century. Stetten Himer was an independent thinker and a free spirit. She really embodied the concept of a modern woman. She was born in 1871 to a wealthy New York City family. She used her financial security to lead her own life, generally rejecting traditional, culturally imposed roles for women. In fact, she was very much a feminist of her day. She opposed marriage because, as marriage was back then, it had curtailed women's creativity, their freedom, and their self-determination. She sought to live her life to secure her art, to secure her creativity. She was a painter, a set designer, a writer, a poet, and she was also a well-recognized art historian and critic. You can see here on the right-hand side here, she was educated in Europe and in New York City in drawing and art history. She was very much part of the avant-garde movement in the early 20th century. Her friends included many of the famous avant-garde artists, including Michel Duchamp, who famously took a male urinal and turned it upside down and put it in a museum as fine art. She was also known for social gatherings in her New York City studio, and you can see a bit of it here on the left. And these gatherings would, for these gatherings, she would invite other artists and intellectuals. And it created what would be called a saloon atmosphere for discussion of the issues of the time. In 1915, 5 years before the 19th Amendment was passed, she painted a self-portrait of herself in the nude, lying on the couch in a very productive pose, like some other artists have, like Monet, Manet, and Goya. Such nude self-portraits were considered absolutely outrageous at the time. But for her, her art was about privacy. It was a private, personal thing. She only showed her art to a limited number of people in her New York studio. For her, her art wasn't about, self-promotion or notoriety, but it was about self-exploration and self-expression. She, in fact, instructed her younger sister, Edie, to destroy all her paintings upon her death because she didn't want them distributed. Edie, however, ignored that and donated them to various museums. In fact, this picture here on the left is her studio during the year she died. And you can see the DIA painting right there. And we were fortunate that Stetten Himer's sister Edie donated it to the DIA. So this is, really depicts a fantastic scene based upon her real life experiences and is populated with her friends and acquaintances. The men are either men she actually knew who were friends or with whom she had relationships, or they are figures from her fantasy. This is a highly personal statement about her relationships and her sexual identity. Well, she's here on the balcony in her signature bubble red hair and red high heels. She's also shown herself here in this kind of Little Bo Peep figure costume, and she's here too, dancing with this harlequin, which is thought to be Michel Duchamp, and it suggests maybe a romantic relationship between them. So Howard, Stetten Himer is just a wonderful example of a woman who established her own independent identity and lived her own life while still embracing her femininity. Any questions?
Question.
Yes.
You said that, and you may not know this, but did she sell any of her paintings, or were they all personal?
There, as far as my understanding is that she didn't sell any of her paintings as far as like publicly or in galleries or in exhibitions.
I didn't know that. Thank you.
Christine, any other questions?
How many of her paintings does the DIA own? Do you know?
I think just this one. That's my understanding.
Okay, and it was donated by her sister after her death?
Right, Edie.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Howard, back to you.
Are you sure? Oh, it is me. Thank you, Ray. Okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to do this piece. So, last week we were talking about Edmonia Lewis. And Edmonia Lewis, if you remember or were with us last week, was her father was a person of African descent. Her mother was an Ojibwe Indian. So she was partially of African descent and partially an Ojibwe Indian. And she was a sculptor. She did marble, and you saw the two pieces that she did of Hiawatha and Minnehaha. And those two pieces were done in the style of a European facial settings. And what we're looking at here is something completely different. So we went from 1870, just after the Civil War, just after the 1868 14th Amendment, making people of color United States citizens, to 1930, 10 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment, and we have Augusta Savage, there's a photograph of Augusta, doing this is a plaster bust that's painted, the bronze pieces at the Museum of Modern Arts, of what she titles a gamin. A gamin in French is a street urchin. And Ray, what do you notice about the features of his face?
Howard, that looks like a real person. It looks like a real young man. It's a young man of African American descent.
That's right.
It's not trying to pander to European taste.
That's right. And that's because of a large intellectual movement that we refer to as the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was a movement of musicians, writers, poets, artists that began to give pride in their African American heritage. They began to take control over their own experience. So they began to speak in their own voice. They began to paint, write, draw, sing to what they felt brought pride and dignity and humanity to the African American culture. And Augusta Savage epitomizes this because she was very strongly related in the development and one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance. As a woman, she was accepted into the community. She worked closely with people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Elaine Locke, who were intellectual writers and sociologists, encouraging other people to demonstrate their humanity to counter the negative stereotypes that white supremacists were trying to push forward. So she did lots of things besides just doing a bust. She created a school where she taught, and she taught people such as Jacob Lawrence, who we talked about a few weeks ago, who did the John Brown series and various other series. There was a quote that I want to read to you. She says, if I can inspire one of these youngsters in contributions of Black women in 1982 to develop the talent I know they possess, then my monument will be to their work. No one could ask for more than that. So not only did she create her own art, but she taught others to create their own art and to speak in their own voice. She won very many awards. She had a scholarship in Paris. She was the first African-American member of the National Association of Women Painters and Sculptors. She was very, very accomplished. And her work is held in many museums today. Christine, are there any questions?
No questions about Augustus Savage at this time.
Thank you. Ray, now that we're getting this straight, now it's your turn.
Thanks, Howard. I appreciate it. This is a wonderful painting. It's the Portrait of Marian Anderson from 1940. It's done by the African-American artist Aaron Douglas. Douglas was a renowned painter and illustrator, and he was really the quintessential visual artist of the Harlem Renaissance, what Howard just described. In fact, he was the first visual artist to join that movement. This particular painting is not owned by the DIA. It's privately owned by Wilson and Deborah Copeland, and also by Lauren. The Copelands are, by the way, are Detroiters, and by Lauren Ninamdi, who is a Florida resident. They were generous enough to have it displayed at the DIA for over 2.5 years. Unfortunately, has been returned to the owners during the COVID shutdown. It depicts a celebrated opera singer and a civil rights activist, Marian Anderson, who lived a very long life. She was born in 1897 and she died in 1993. So she lived into her 90s. She was an American singer of classical music and also of spirituals. She performed her concerts and recitals in major music venues and with very famous orchestras in the United States and Europe during the period of 1925 through 1965, so 40 years. She is considered an important figure in the struggle for Black artists to overcome racial prejudice in the United States during the 20th century. Here's a photograph of her. So in 1939, the year before our portrait was made there, Anderson was denied the opportunity to perform to a segregated audience at the DAR Constitutional Hall. The DAR stands for the Daughters of the American Revolution. It was the largest concert facility in Washington, D.C. at the time. The only other suitable location was at a white high school, and I say white because there was segregation in the public schools in Washington, D.C. at that time, and the high school would not permit her to do her recital there. Unfortunately, the Constitutional Hall had a white performers only policy, and the DAR rejected her petition to make an exception so she could have her concert. When then First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt found out about this, she gave up her membership at the DAR in protest, formed a committee, and they arranged for the singer to give her concert at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, with the Mall of Washington as her auditorium. It was extremely symbolistic. In fact, they even went to the extent of holding the concert on Easter Sunday in 1939 to more enhance the symbolism. The crowd that day in person was over 75,000 people that crowded the mall, and it was also carried on international radio stations to an audience thought to be millions and millions of people. It was actually a monumental event in the civil rights movement. And there are many photographs and paintings of Marian Anderson because of her contributions to civil rights. And all of them, almost all of them, have this sort of serious pose, like this photo. You know, you've got this dramatic light and a very serious face. In contrast, the picture that Douglas does is, you know, someone who, you know, is warm and, you know, it conveys some friendliness. It really shows her humanity. You know, she's an individual, not a grand figure, not a mystical figure, but really a person who did amazing things, an approachable person who did amazing things. So, like these other women, you know, this shows, you know, depicts the changing role of women. Here is a Black woman responsible for and took a brave leadership role in an event to overcome segregation. It's an amazing story and an amazing painting. Christine, do we have any questions?
Ray, can you tell us what is the DAR?
Oh, it's the Daughters. Oh, exactly what it is. It stands for the Daughters of the American Revolution. These are people who trace their lineage, you know, their ancestors, to the founding fathers. You know, those people who signed the Declaration of Independence, were part of the Constitutional Convention. So it's, you know, considered a very prestigious institution, and Eleanor Roosevelt traced her background to one of the founders.
Okay, so Constitutional Hall was controlled by their group then?
Yeah, it was, yes. The DAR is, it's called the DAR Constitutional Hall, or at least it was at that particular time.
And at that time, it was segregated, and they did not play to integrated audiences.
The first problem is they didn't even allow non-white performers. So, you know, the petition was for both, Christine, but she couldn't even perform there. They wouldn't even allow her to perform there. And which is ironic, Christine, because she was known internationally. She had sung with the finest orchestras around the world, in Europe and the United States, because she had such a wonderful voice. But unfortunately, at that particular time, she wasn't even permitted to sing in Constitutional Hall.
But Eleanor Roosevelt intervened so that she did sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Right.
To 75,000 people? More
than 75,000 people. That was that's the history of that. Yeah. So it was quite an event. As I said, it was considered a monumental moment in the civil rights movement. Should we go to the next one?
Thank you.
Sure. This is a wonderful sculpture, and it's done by an African-American artist, Elizabeth Collett. It was done in about 1960, and it's not very big. It's actually rather small. It's only 8.25 inches high. It's about 9.25 inches wide, and you can't see this unfortunately in this slide, but it's about 11 inches deep. And it's displayed in our African American galleries, prominently displayed on a pedestal in our African American galleries. Now, Elizabeth Collett was, as I said, an African American artist born in 1915, 5 years before the 19th Amendment was passed. She was an extremely successful artist. She was a sculptor, a teacher, and a woman's advocate. She was also well educated, and she was one of the very first women, black or white, very first women to receive a master's in fine arts, which was a new postgraduate degree at the time. In her graduate school, her professor told her or advised her that she should create work of what she knew about. So she began depicting works of African American women and children. And she's really known for her female forms, particularly depicting the strength and the dignity of African American women. In effect, her works give honor and respect to African American women. Now, the appearance, Howard, of this particular piece is interesting because if you notice the face, Howard,
Yeah.
this doesn't look like she's trying to represent an actual person. These features are, have an otherness quality to them. And then you have this textured hair with them. There's a reason why she decided to do both of those things, because she's trying in this particular piece to show the strength and beauty of women of two different cultures. The first culture is a culture that lived was located primarily in Mexico 2,000 years ago. It's called the Olmec Culture. And the Olmec Culture, they were known for these, what they called colossal heads. And we have an example of it. These are enormous rocks that are carved, and typically, like this particular one, of a powerful Olmec male ruler. They are, they show, gravity, importance. They show an otherness too, just like the way Collett shows in her sculpture. So she is playing on that monumental quality that's typically of the powerful male rulers in that community. So that's one culture, Howard. And the second is, this texture of this hair is like women of African ancestry. And so she's combining these two in not a typical way that these particular cultures would be shown. And the idea here is this is small but monumental. It's intended to show the victory of Black and Third World peoples from oppressors. And she shows that victory by using a female figure and not a male figure. And there's a portrait of the artist. So she lived in Mexico from 1947 until her death in 2012. She married a Mexican artist, Francisco Mora, and she raised 3 children while accomplishing so much in her life. Among those feats, not only are artistic accomplishments, but in her fame in that regard, but she was the first full professor at the University of Mexico. So here is an artist that focused on the social challenges of Black women and decided to use her art to challenge negative social attitudes. Christine, any questions?
Ray, I have a question.
Sure, Howard.
Could we go back to the piece? So
Yeah.
Is that piece, see, every time I look at that piece, when I go by it, I keep thinking it's made out of wood, but it's not, is it?
No, it's terracotta, just like it said, which is kind of a clay. In the simplest form, it's like clay. It's like pottery, it's not wood at all. And I could in this particular slide, Howard, it does look like it might be carved.
Okay, thanks, Ray.
Sure, Christine, anything?
You mentioned that Elizabeth Catlett was one of the first Black women in America to graduate with a master's degree in art.
Yes, actually, she's one of the first women, Black or white. And a master's in fine arts, it was a relatively new degree at the time. So, it just shows how much of a pioneer she was.
And in Mexico, you mentioned that she became a professor at the University of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Did she have that tenure for a long time?
Yes, that's my understanding. She was a full professor.
For most of her adult life there.
Yeah, exactly, Christine, exactly. She was quite an accomplished woman.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Howard, I think you're up.
Thank you, sir. So this piece is a really interesting piece that we're generally not going to talk about, Ray. And I'll tell you why in a second. Let me talk about.
We're not going to do the family photos again, are we, Howard?
No.
Okay.
All right. So this is a study. It's about 24 inches by about 20 inches for a large mural that was done at Clark University. The artist, Hale Woodruff, is a very well-known African-American muralist. He studied and he worked with the Diego Rivera, who you might remember, Ray, from some of the work he did at the DIA. But I don't really want to talk about that other than to say that this study was one of a series of studies that he did, that the DIA owns this study. The murals are at Clark University. They're 12 feet by 12 feet, and Clark University is one of the historic Black colleges and universities in the country. It's in Atlanta. It was founded right after the Civil War. And there are 17 people here. And in fact, Ray just talked about Marian Anderson, and this is Marian Anderson, and this is Phyllis Wheatley, and this is Frederick Douglass, and this is Booker T. Washington, and there's other artists that we actually have a key here about who all the artists are. But I want to talk about person number 7, this person right here. This person right here, her name is Sojourner Truth. Here is Sojourner Truth. And Sojourner Truth started out life as her name was Isabel. Now, see, I'm having a moment. Isabella Bumfrey. Her name was Isabella Bumfrey, and she was an enslaved person of African descent. And Ray, she was enslaved not in the South, but in New York State. And, you know, it's surprising to me because you think of New York or the North as being a place that fought against slavery, which it did, but not until 1828 did New York State emancipate its slaves. So I think what we all need to remember is there was also the enslavement of people of African descent was nationwide. It was not just a scourge in the South, although later it did continue to be that. But on to Sojourner. Sojourner Truth was enslaved in New York State. She couldn't wait. I don't blame her for the emancipation. She escaped from her enslavement in 1826 with her daughter, her infant daughter. Later, she found out that her son, who had been taken from her and sold to a man that took him to Alabama, was improperly or illegally sold, which, if you can believe that sentence, like as if it were ever really legal to sell anybody, she was illegally sold, and she sued in court. And get this, Ray, she won. She won a case, she won a court case and had her son returned to her. She eventually became a very well-known abolitionist and advocate for women's rights. She made a very famous speech in 1851 at the Women's Rights Convention. She called it, and she titled it, "Ain't I a Woman?" And that's become a very famous epigram for women's rights even today. In 2017, there was a Black women's rights movement that took that motto as theirs, based on what Sojourner Truth talked about. So she fought hard and widely, very well-known abolitionist and women's rights advocate. And she was a longtime resident of Battle Creek, Michigan. When she passed away in 1883, she was buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek. So her remains are close by to us. Christine, are there any questions?
Do you know what brought her to Michigan?
Cereal? No, I don't know. I do not know what brought her to Michigan.
Now, I heard she was involved also in the Underground Railroad.
Yes, she was involved in the Underground Railroad. I don't have all that much information about her involvement in the Underground Railroad. She did help to recruit Black soldiers for the Civil War rights. She met with Abraham Lincoln, who thanked her personally for doing that. And she did work for civil rights for all African Americans throughout her life. But I know that she did work and help with the process of the Underground Railroad, which was a series of safe houses, so to speak, that helped runaway enslaved people of African descent to gain their freedom.
Okay, and her work with the suffrage movement is, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, yes, in 1851, she delivered the speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" to the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio. As I said, it was one of the most famous speeches. She would work with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the other women's suffrage rights persons to speak on behalf of women's rights and the reason why they had just as much right to voice their political opinion and participate in political life as any man did.
Okay, thank you. And there was a question about the artwork, the Hal Woodruff that we just passed by. Is that on display in the African American galleries?
It is currently not on display, and we're not sure. I mean, obviously, right now we don't know what's on display, if anything's been changed. But our guess is that everything that was prior to the closing still on display, and so it's currently not on display.
Okay, and you said it's a study for a larger mural at Clark Atlanta University?
It is a small study, about 2 feet by 2 feet, for a large 12-foot by 12-foot mural, which is a series of murals. This is one of them at Clark University.
Does this mural look like our Rivera Court murals?
It's similar, Christine. He did study with Diego Rivera. He did like that style that Diego used, that Rivera used. And so you can almost see kind of the influence that Rivera had in the way he paints and draws and does it. But they are frescoes. The murals at Clark are frescoes, just like the murals in Rivera Court at the museum.
Okay, thank you.
And now it is my pleasure. It is my pleasure to introduce the newest member of our Thursday at the Museum team. Cindy Patrick is a wonderful docent, very personable, and she is going to be talking about this wonderful piece and the artist that did it. Cindy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Howard. This next work of art that we're going to be taking a look at, we're actually jumping ahead quite a few decades. The artist Mickalene Thomas was born in the early 70s. She's categorized as a contemporary artist, but in this work titled Something You Can Feel, the subject matter is firmly anchored in the 1970s, which was a watershed decade for the women's liberation movement. It was a time when women were seeking freedom of choice, gender equality in the workplace, and equal pay. We see a woman front and center. She's leveling her assertive gaze. She's confident and provocative in all of her bedazzled splendor. I love saying bedazzled splendor. Mickalene's work is greatly influenced by her relationship with her mother, Sandra Bush, who at a statuesque 6'1" became a successful high fashion model during the 70s. At times, she walked the runway in the swirling geometric prints of the designer Emilio Pucci. The pieced together and layered patterns of her collage compositions are reflections of Pucci fabrics and fashion magazines of the times like Ebony, Essence, and Jet. She often includes a section of wood paneling, and if you could point that out, Howard, it's the kind that would have been seen in every den and rec room of that era. And typically her themes do center on very strong women. Most of her paintings are of women of color, and the women are usually shown in poses that are dignified and, as this one, sometimes provocative. Her technique of layering acrylic and enamel paint, she encrusts it with sequins, rhinestones, and beads. Unfortunately, the shimmering effect of the rhinestones isn't something that shows in our PowerPoint here today, but Howard's kind of pointing out to you where those areas are. The materials that she works with are heavy, and so they require a sturdier base than canvas. So she uses a wood panel backboard. That, combined with the weight of these heavier materials, brings this painting in at 80 pounds. And if the subject matter alone isn't enough to grab your attention, then the sheer size of the painting at 8'10" is a commanding presence in our contemporary African American galleries. The title, Something You Can Feel, comes from the Aretha Franklin and Curtis Mayfield collaboration of the song Something He Can Feel, which was composed for the 1976 movie Sparkle. The plot focused on the talent and the struggles of African American singers and was loosely based on the history of the Supremes. So here we see Mickalene's complex vision of what it means to be a woman. In her hands, this woman is bright, polished, she's dignified and self-assured, she's shimmering in her own fabulousness, a true woman of the 70s. Do we have any questions, Christine?
Did you say, can you talk a little bit about this being a collage?
She has a special technique that she uses when she's getting ready to create her next work of art. And in her studio, she'll actually set up a physical set with furniture. She'll have the model pose, she'll take photographs, and then she cuts and pieces those photographs together to create the composition. And the work that we have on exhibit at the DIA, it doesn't have a smooth, flat surface. Instead, the surface is actually three-dimensional, not only because of the use of the materials, but also because of the piecing together from the photographs.
It's really large, and you mentioned how heavy it is.
Yes, it's 8 feet by 10 feet, and it weighs over 80 pounds.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Hey, Ray?
Howard, I think you have the next one, but I think we have a delightful photo of the artist, Mickalene Thomas, in the next one. There she is.
Yes, this is a photograph of Mickalene, and this is from last year at a show that she had at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And hopefully it translates, and you can see from this photograph that she inherited her mother's very tall stature. Mickalene is also, of 6 foot plus height, just like her mother.
Hey, Ray, I think that Cindy did a great job. What do you think? We should keep her one more?
You know what? Yeah, Howard, I have a question. Can she take your place?
I don't know.
I'm kidding. Howard, I'm just kidding, my friend. I think you're up with the next piece.
This is a wonderful piece.
Oh, I totally agree, Howard.
This is an amazing piece for so many different reasons. First of all, just, the artist is Mario Moore. He's a local artist. We know him real well. His grandmother is the focus of this piece, Helen Moore, Queen Mother Helen Moore. Queen Mother is a very strong honorific in African culture. And just think about it, just the piece itself, this golden background, this is a piece of copper plate that Mario painted this image on. That's just so photorealistic. So think about the talent of the artist to be able to paint with oil a painting of his mom and his 3 uncles and make it look just like that. So just the painting itself is astounding to me. And now the subject matter and the message that it talks about is even more important and impressive. So let me read you what's on the panel next to it at the museum and what the artist Mario has said about his grandmother Helen. My grandmother is a powerful figure in Detroit and beyond. Her presence shows a contrast to the mourning mother image we see through media portrayals of Black women after their sons are murdered at the hands of police officers. Instead, she holds photographs of her living sons, providing protection for the Black male body. Mario Moore wrote that in 2017. This piece is on display and at the DIA galleries. This is Mario's father, his two uncles, and she's displaying her pride in their achievements in graduating from school. This is Helen Moore when she comes to the museum. Here she is next to her piece, and this is her proud and talented grandson, Mario. And this is the piece obviously behind them. So, you know, for those of you out there that do portraits, that do images, this is something really to aspire to, because not only is the virtuosity of the painting done, but it contains the emotion, the personality, and the message. So an artist does more than just become photorealistic. He brings emotion and meaning to that. And with today's Black Lives Matter movement and today's call for social justice, and with today's movement for tearing down the walls of systemic racism, we are combining women's suffragette movement with a larger movement of social justice. But the thing to know about Helen and the Queen Mother Helen Moore is that she is a strong advocate for social justice for children in the Detroit school system. She will be at Detroit school board meetings, speaking on behalf of schools, of the school children, and advocating for improvement in education, because without education, we all agree you can't get anywhere. So this piece speaks to so many different things. It speaks to the civil rights movement that had the beginnings for people like Mario Moore. It speaks to where we put things in context, where we talked about the Seneca Falls in 1848, suffrage in the 19th Amendment in 1920, the Brown versus Board of Education ruling that separate but equal is not constitutional in 1954, and finally the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, bringing equality, or the promise of equality, to all people of all colors. Christy, are there any questions?
Actually, there is an observation.
Yes.
And the viewer was looking at this piece and harking back to the idea of Renaissance painting, and how oftentimes altarpieces had triptychs or 3 panels. And this painting kind of reminded them of that, and the Queen Mother, Helen Moore, being the spiritual figure in the center, and the 3 young men being part of the triptych.
Christine, we need to recruit that person to possibly replace Ray at this point.
Yeah, that's, as we say, we want everybody to find personal meaning in art, right?
Oh, and they did. I'm glad to hear that. That was really well said. Thank you, viewer. I appreciate that. Anything else?
Yes, there's another one that just came in, and it says, Mario proudly tells of growing up from the age of 4 and going to work with his mom at CCS and at the DIA. And his mother, the viewer is noting that his mother, Sabrina Nelson, is still very involved with the DIA.
I love to talk about this piece because it's familiar with everybody in the area. When I was at the museum talking to some people about it, a woman said, "Oh, I know her." You know, I know her. I know who she is. And so it's bringing the whole story close to home. So thank you for that also, viewer. Anything else?
We have a Detroit connection with a personal message.
Yeah, it's meaningful. It's meaningful to all of us.
All right, thank you.
We're lucky to have it. Well, thank you. Okay, I believe that, Ray, you are up to finish us off.
Yes, and this is perhaps the perfect piece of art to finish off our Suffragette tour. And it's called Woman's Equality from 1975 by Marisa. Marisa was a woman artist. She was born Marisol Escobar. She was born to Venezuelan parents, wealthy parents, who at the time lived in Paris. Unfortunately, when Marisol was in her early teens, her mother tragically died, and her father sent her to boarding schools in the United States. And she essentially stayed in the United States all her life. She became an American in a sense. And that's why it says Venezuelan American there on the painting, or at least the slide. She was very much part of the women's movement, Marisol. The women's movement that Cindy was describing was a change in, social roles in society. So this particular lithograph, it's a lithograph. Marisol was a pop artist and really took her place among the male pop artists at the time. Lithograph is a type of working of art. It's not painted. It's a process that was popular with those kinds of artists because it was a manufactured process. These two women that are shown are the two key figures of the early women's rights movement. To your left is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and to your right is Lucretia Mott. And there we have Portrait of Marisol to the left, Stanton in the center, and Mott to the right. Lucretia Mott was a feminist activist, an abolitionist. She was a social reformer and a pacifist who helped launch the women's rights movement. She was raised as a Quaker, and the Quaker tenet at that time was that all people were created equal. She spent literally her entire life fighting for social and political reform for women, for blacks, and for other marginalized groups. Mott was really very instrumental in the women's rights movement, as was in the center there, Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton also was an abolitionist and was really maybe one of the leading figures in the early movement. She was an eloquent writer, Howard. She was a fantastic writer. And she wrote a seminal work called Declaration of Sentiments. And it was really a revolutionary call for the women's rights across a variety of spectrums. The Declaration really expanded upon the Declaration of Independence, and it inserted for men, women, or women instead of men throughout. And it also called for social and legal changes to elevate women's place in society. And in fact, it listed 18 specific grievances, from the inability to control their wages and their property, or the difficulty of gaining custody in divorces, or to the lack of the right to vote. Stanton also was the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association for 20 years, and she worked closely with Susan B. Anthony. Now, Stanton and Mott became close friends and allies during the 1940 Anti-Slavery Convention in London. They led a protest against the vote by male delegates who had denied women participating in the proceeding. In 1948, it was Stanton and Mott who led the first women's rights convention that we've mentioned in Seneca Falls, New York. That was, as we've said, the first organized effort to promote women's rights, including the right to vote. So here Marisa portrays them in this commemorative lithograph. It's done at, as I said, at the height of the women's movement, and that movement represented a societal shift concerning women's roles and their identity. 2 years before this lithograph was done, the Equal Rights Amendment had passed the Congress and was passed on to the states for ratification. That amendment provided for legal equality of the sexes and prohibited discrimination based upon sex. Unfortunately, it failed to receive adoption by 2/3 of the states, which is what's required in the Constitution for a new amendment. But Congress has passed various legislation that tried to fill the gap left by the failure of the passage to sort of effectuate some of the rights that the amendment sought to guarantee. Now, these hands are women, there's hands here of women joining Stanton and Mott. These aren't their hands. These are other women's hands. In fact, I know this looks like it might be Mott and Stanton holding together, but Howard, can you see that this is not, this should be Stanton's right hand, and if it was her right hand, right, it would be her palm back, right? But this is a palm, this is somebody's left hand, and gripping, you can see the thumb at the top.
Reaching out.
Right, and here is Marisol's own hand. This is Marisol's own hand. And it's to symbolize modern women embracing their heritage, embracing these pioneers. And this is just such an appropriate work to end our commemoration of the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. Here we have Stanton and Mott, the founders of the suffrage movement and the women's rights movement, all joined in symbolistic sisterhood with those who are currently continuing for the movement of equal rights. Any questions, Christine?
Hey, Ray, before you ask for questions, I want to just take a moment before we end to do a shout out to Commissioner Marcia Gershenson.
I was going to thank her, Howard.
Okay, so you go ahead.
No, but first of all, Christine, anything?
Yeah, one of the viewers noticed that you mistakenly said 1948 instead of 1848.
Oh, geez, I'm sorry. We're trying to stay on time and we're a little over. I apologize, Christine. It's 1848, and thank you for whoever observed that.
Okay.
Anything else?
No, there's a question about what is pop art, but I know we're on a time schedule, so I'll answer that privately.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm sorry I skipped over that, but we're running a little long today, and we wanted to conclude. Yeah, we are, and I want to conclude our program for today. On behalf of Cindy, Howard, and myself, we really enjoyed doing this tour and doing this about this important centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. We also wanted, as Howard was saying, to thank the Commissioner Gershenson, for her involvement and suggestion of this programming. And we also want to thank our viewers for attending. Next week, our program is called It's a Zoo in Here. And no, that's not about Howard's household. It's actually a program, it's going to be a lot of fun, it's a themed program about pieces of art in the museum having to do with birds and animals. And I think you'll really enjoy it. It'll be a lot of fun. So in the meantime, please be well and stay safe.
Bye, everybody.